As I almost missed my plane coming here, I was thinking, I wonder what they'll do. Yeah. So sometimes even the best plans need another strategy. So we're going to be talking about strategic planning tonight. Brief intro to me. My name is Garth Nowland-Foreman. I'm one of the directors of Lead Centre for Not-for-Profit Governance and Leadership, and my particular specialty in that group is around governance issues and also strategy. So tonight brings together two of those particular interests. And a third thing that I focus on is on evaluation and monitoring. The Lead itself as an organisation has only been around for 3 years, but all of us working in it have been involved in the not-for-profit sector for at least a quarter of a century. We're that old. Yeah. And in lots of different roles, running organisations, as funders of organisations, and as helping train and build the capacity of not-for-profit organisations. So I think that's the most important thing to know about me. Apart from the fact that I have 2 adult boys, which has probably irreparably shaped my life. I came to New Zealand 26 years ago from the West Island. So you'll notice my West Island accent, which I read this week is only the 6th sexiest accent in the world. I've got no idea who the judges were that decided that the New Zealand accent was the sexiest accent in the world. I think it was a bunch of New Zealanders. That's the only explanation. Anyway, before I get too distracted, let's get going. So tonight is called Getting Real About Strategy because I think there's a lot of myths and a lot of misunderstandings about strategy, which I hope to help us deal with in a way that will be a little bit more practical than some of the stuff that's written in theory about how this should go. Now, can people see that okay? Yep, the light's not too bright for you. So here is a picture of a company that outside of Christchurch who produce septic tanks. So they call themselves strategic tanks. And that, for me, when I drove past that, I had to stop to take a picture because it kind of symbolises the word strategic is now applied to anything that you want to mean really important or big. So now the word strategic has no other meaning than really important or big. You know, strategic thinking, strategic initiatives, strategic development, strategic housing, strategic meals at restaurants. I don't know. That's the only one I haven't yet discovered. But basically, it's used as an adjective for almost anything. So as such, it's almost been completely drained of any meaning. So that's the first thing. It's hard to actually get a grip on this thing that means everything and nothing. The second thing is that there is a lot of oh, sorry, that's not meant to be there. That was. There is a lot of playing let's pretend about strategy. So that, especially if you're an organisation with staff, the most common thing that's likely to happen is that staff will prepare a strategic plan, take it to the board will spot the spelling mistake on page 3 and adopt the plan pretending that it developed the strategic plan. Now, there's actually a very good reason for this, which we'll come to a bit later on. So it's not just a coincidence that this happens very frequently. And it's partly to do with the fact that if you've got staff, if you're a big enough organisation to have staff, the staff will often be in the best position to do the planning. yet we pretend that it's the board that sets the strategy. Even in all volunteer organisations, the confusion about the word strategy can kind of leave us lumbering around about what that actually means. And there's a third problem, which we will talk about in a little bit more detail. Though intriguingly, I won't do that till later on, because the third problem is I don't believe in strategic planning. But we'll go through some other things first before I take you to that point. Here's a couple more of the strategic planning let's pretend games. So I'll just read it out in case you can't read that. So, struggling to finish a strategic plan, we went undercover at a successful organisation to find out how they did it. So these are strategic planning magic tricks. So reaching consensus. The official story says everyone worked as a team to determine what was best for the organisation, but what really happened was you were getting sleepy, you were putting aside all personal agendas and striving for consensus. You will agree to what I say. Writing the plan, the official story was we systematically analysed all the data we had gathered and formulated it into a plan. But what was really going on was I've stuffed all of your shredded data into the hat, and with one tap of the magic wand, voila, I'll produce the plan. And the third strategic planning magic trick was about implementing the plan. And the official story was, after intensive proposal writing, we found the needed funding to implement the plan. How it really happened, a genie came along, we rubbed the magic lamp, and she said, I'll grant you all the money you ever needed to do everything you ever wanted to put in your strategic plan. Okay, so what actually then is strategy? Now, at this point, for any newcomers, I need to explain that the strategic placemat that you have in front of you, because it's really big and important, so I can call it a strategic placemat, is also a colouring in competition, or because at the end of each night, I do give a prize, a fabulous prize, which I must say people have been saying is getting better every month, which means we started out really low, but it's getting better every month, to the person who has the most colourful, messiest, or best placemat. So this is to encourage you to play and use and make a mess on the placemat rather than leave it nice and pristine apart from the pizza droppings. And you'll see on there that there is this person juggling these three balls on your placemat, and a space for you to think about what are the three things that strategic thinking, planning, strategy is trying to juggle. So you can say strategy are the decisions or choices which seek to relate these three things together. Okay, so I won't leave you totally in the blank. I'll give you three clues. I'll just leave out a crucial word in each case and see if you can fill in the crucial word. It's about balancing or relating the blank at your disposal, the blank in which the organisation operates, and the expectations and objectives of various blanks. Okay, so see if you can guess what those three things are. You can confer your neighbours at the table, and I have a small but not fabulous prize available for anyone who guesses all three, or maybe even if you guess one. The blank at its disposal, it refers to the organisation that's doing the strategy. The blank in which the organisation operates, and the expectations and objectives of various blanks. So feel free to confer with other people at your table if you want to while I get my prize. Super. Anyone think they know one of them? What do you were the first, yes?
I know all three.
All right. Well, don't be too confident. See if you get the first one.
Yeah, let's just go for one.
One at a time.
We think that the environment in which organisations operate.
The environment. So the second one is the environment. Okay. So I can't reveal the correct answer because I do it in order. So it'll be this one first. Has anyone got a guess about what that? Yeah.
The resources.
The resources at its disposal and the environment in which it operates. Let's see if that's what the answer is, according to Faulkner and Johnson. Yes, congratulations. So was that a table effort? Or was it an individual effort?
Yeah, we're team players.
All right, well, I'll get you a knife later.
Oh.
Or alternatively, if we can't find a knife, just suck on it for about people are demanding. I'll give you 3 then. Okay, so first one was right. Second one, yes, congratulations. It is the environment that's operating. I know you'll probably argue for 3 things. I said the ugly person and all.
Can I say I don't
You can say whatever you like. Oh, I just won't respond to it. Okay.
No, nobody likes to.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Other table guess the last one. Expectations and objectives of various. Anyone? Any other table? I'll give the other tables a chance first. Otherwise, we'll go back and. No one else wants to have a go?
The stakeholders.
Stakeholders, correct. Yes.
Wow.
Well done. So, I'll give you one of each of these tables. Right. So, it's about trying to hold these 3 things in balance. And of course, are any of you good at juggling? Oh, great. I've been taught 4 times and have still not learnt. 4 different people have tried to teach me how simple it is to juggle 3 balls, and I always fail. I think it must be a basic lack of hand-eye coordination. I'm not sure. But it's like that with strategy as well, because when one issue changes, it actually affects all the others as well. They don't stay still. So it's not like holding 3 balls, it is like juggling 3 balls. About the resources that we've got, the environment we have to operate in, and the expectations of the stakeholders that have some stake in our organisation. So just a quick definition of stakeholders. It's anyone who has an interest in or is affected by the decisions that our organisation makes. So it would include beneficiaries, clients, members, funders, all those kind of people, the usual suspects. So that's the kind of thing that strategy is trying to balance, and it is dynamic, and it's also ambiguous, because we know a little bit about the environment in which we operate in, but who knows everything, and who knows what the size of things will be tomorrow, let alone today. So it's not only dynamic, it's also ambiguous. There's a fair degree of ambiguity that's going on, and certainly all of those things are complex. Expectations of one set of stakeholders is often complex, let alone when you add multiple sets. So it's complex, ambiguous, and dynamic. That's the kind of situation we have to operate in. And that's why a lot of the simplistic ideas about strategy don't actually work in the real world. They can take you so far, but then you kind of hit dead ends. But before we look at that in a little bit more detail, I'd like us to have a bit of a think about what we bring to strategy as individuals, because whenever people develop strategy, the people are as important as the strategy. So first of all, I'll just get us to in a moment, stand up and put ourselves on a human continuum. We'll do it over this side of the room, it's got the most space. Just move this chair in, so it's not out of the way. And at one end of the continuum is, I'm a born opportunistic. You know, I like to see things, I will respond to what comes along, I make the most of opportunities, I'm always looking for things that are on the horizon and new and different. So we'll put the opportunists down this end. And I'm born planful. You know, I like to set out objectives, criteria, I like to allocate dates and goals and people to tasks. I write lots of lists because I like to plan things rather than just respond to what comes up on the day. Okay, that makes sense. So you can be anywhere on this continuum. It's a continuum, so it's not a straight line. Everyone could be at the same point. Unlikely, but it could be. So don't worry if there's already someone at the point that you think you are on this continuum. You can have as many people on any of the points that you like. So now's your chance to get up and move and work off some of the calories from the pizza that you just eaten. Planful. Yes. Great. Okay. So with our own predilections to be either to be more planful or more opportunistic, we're likely to seize different bits of the strategy process. And we'll be more enthusiastic about those bits, less enthusiastic about the others. So it is important to have a look at the overall picture, and there's quite a few different models. So if you go to the literature, you'll find lots of different models of strategic planning. Even in just if you look in not-for-profit strategy, you'll find quite a few different models. A guy called Bryson in the, I didn't put the date here, but I think it was around about the turn of the century, around the 2000s, tried to summarize the main thrust of most of the models. And he developed what he called his, no, he didn't call it his model of strategic general planning, he called it his general model of strategic planning. Sorry. Obviously didn't see that when I wrote it. Usually I only see mistakes when you print 500 copies of them, so it's handy that I've only seen it on here. So it's Bryson's general model of strategic planning. So he hoped to try and summarise most of the general approaches to strategy, especially for non-profits. And I think he pretty much was successful. You know, there are variations of this, but basically, so his model is up on the wall. He talked about the importance of having an initial agreement. Who authorises you to plan? You know, is it the board? Is it the members? Whoever it is? Is it for the whole organisation? Is it for a team? Is it for a geographical area? So that you know what, and is it for 12 months or 5 years or 20 years? A couple of years ago, Naitahu produced a plan for their tribe, and it's for, I think, from memory, 250 years. That's the timeline that they wanted to plan. So obviously, the timeline, the audience, the geography, the authorization of the plan affects what you do. All strategic planning needs to be based on the mandate that you have. So that'll be your constitution, or in the other thing that sets the organisation up. It might be from the members, and your particular mission and values, and your stakeholders' views about that as well. Almost all strategic planning uses a thing called a SWOT tool. I forgot about the arrows being the dot. Take it off here. So I've done that slightly out of order. SWOT tool. Has anyone heard of SWOT before? Probably most people have. You know what it stands for? S is for strengths, W, weaknesses, O is for opportunities, T is for threats. Yep. So we'll have a look at that in a moment, but basically OT the OT of SWOT is what's outside the organisation, and the SWOT of SWOT is what's inside the organisation. Strengths and weaknesses of the organisation, the opportunities and threats in the environment. Looks like my opportunities. Oh no, there they are. They just came in late. The strengths and weaknesses. And generally out of this process, the idea is that you can identify what are the strategic issues that your plan needs to deal with, and for each of those strategic issues you'll develop the strategy or the response or the plan for what you would do for those, the practical alternatives, major proposals, and that should lead to your vision of success, which should relate back to all these things here at the beginning as well. The trouble is, up to this point, each step naturally produces the next result in the equation. After here, every strategic planning book in the world, he says confidently, basically assumes and then something magical happens. Out of this, you identify the strategic issues and the strategies that are the most effective way of dealing with those issues. There is no book that I have come across, no video on YouTube that I've watched, no podcast that I've heard that actually tells you how you can generate the strategic issues out of this stuff, or how, even once you know what the strategic issues are, you can develop the best possible strategies to deal with it. So up until this point, it's a very logical, almost mechanical process, and then all of a sudden it says, and then a miracle happens. Often that's the awkward bit in a strategic planning meeting, where people stop and wonder. One of the results of this is that often the SWOT analyses don't actually really get used. They get produced, but they don't actually lead to anything, because people soon find out that every strength also has a weakness, every opportunity is also a threat, and you just get longer and longer lists that are unordered or unstructured, and it's hard to make sense out of that. So the planful people are going really well up to this point and pushing the whole thing along, and then all of a sudden they look around to think what's next. At this point, the opportunists jump in and just make wild suggestions, usually out of nowhere, or just whatever they heard on the radio that morning, or what they've been thinking about, which can be great ways of identifying things to happen. I sound like I'm being disparaging, I'm not necessarily. But that's usually where they come from. They don't necessarily relate to all of this stuff. And hopefully it's not totally inconsistent with all of this, but it's almost like it's a separate process. The strategy stuff, the same kind of magic seems to happen there as well, or needs to happen there. I think the reason this is a problem is that people like Bryson and others, like 99% of people who talk about strategy, operate on a machine metaphor, that organisations are like machines, cogs in the wheel, and if you push this button, that result will happen. If you turn that lever, this thing will come out at the other end. And any of us who've dealt with human beings know that the human beings actually are nuisances. They clog up the machine, they don't let the machine operate smoothly, and in fact they stop being inert mechanical parts and start living themselves and interacting and responding and generating new stuff that nice stable cogs don't do themselves. So that's part of the reason why this is gets a little bit messy. Got to give you another reason, and then we'll come back to work out how we resolve it. So stay in the messiness for a little while. The other reason is that partly due to this kind of logical thinking approach, which is based on a machine metaphor that input results in output, and every time you do the same input, you should get the same output. Anyone raised a child? Do the same input, get the same output every time? Yeah. Not even with the same child, let alone have two of them. Anyway, enough of human beings, they just mess up everything. But the behind this idea of input-output simplicity is the model that planning works like this. You think, you do the thinking, out of that comes the plan of what you're going to do, and then you do it. Sounds logical, it is logical, it just doesn't actually happen that way. And in fact, there's research to show that what happens much more frequently, and I mean much more frequently, is that that didn't happen. What have I done wrong here? Sorry. Did it?
It moved to act.
Okay. That's what it was supposed to do.
It
I'll just
moved
go back to that.
act to before
Yeah.
think.
So I'll just go back to that. So what much more frequently happens is that we act. We think about what happened when we act, and as a result of that reflection on the action, we make a plan. Which sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually what happens in the real world. And seeing as I went to so much trouble to put that on an overhead, I'm going to show it to you again. It's very fancy, this. Yeah. So there's we think, plan, and act, but much more frequently we act, think, and plan. And of course, all of the options are possible. We can act, plan, and then think. We can think, act, and then plan. We can do it in any kind of combinations. But in the real world, this is the most common way human beings, and because organisations are made up of human beings, it's also, according to the research that is available, the most common ways that organisations plan and strategise, by doing the acting first and reflecting on that. So instead of that nice logical series of steps, it is much more like that when we're trying to strategize and plan. And if you want to know some of the technical terms for the messiness, a guy called, sorry?
Isn't it more of a think, plan, act, think, plan?
Well, maybe. You can do any of them. But the most common is the act, think, plan. And part of the reason I say that is that most plans are of more archival use than they are in terms of changing things. So some plans do actually change things, but mostly what they record is changes that are at least already starting to happen, and usually would happen whether we wrote them down or not. But sometimes what it does allow us to do, and the plan at the end rather than the beginning, is it allows us to work out what to put more energy, resources, or focus on. Because if we think about the actions work the most, then we can plan to do that again with greater effort. So, does that make sense? I know it's a little bit counterintuitive. I'll give you the more technical explanation, which might make more sense. Henry Mintzberg is one of, if you're asked to name 3 top management strategists in the world, he would be on everyone's list of the top 3. He's Canadian. He lectures part-time at university. He spends the other half of his time consulting with Fortune 500 companies and with some of the richest countries in the world on issues of strategy. He also wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. He's the person who taught me not to believe in strategic planning, one of the world's foremost strategists. One of the things that he discovered from his research of working with real life firms, and I think it applies to non-profits just as much, is that that process that we think happens doesn't actually happen, and it's often reversed. He gave it fancy terms so that he can charge $1,000 an hour, but it's the same idea as just reversing the think, act, do. Think, act, plan. So what he talked about as intended, he called intended strategy is like the plans that people have. And what he found in the real world was, you'll notice that the plans are a lot bigger than the deliberate strategy, what actually gets implemented. Most plans don't actually get implemented, or don't get implemented in the time frame, or only get implemented partially. There's something, no, I won't quote those figures because I can't quite remember them, but the majority of the plans don't happen as planned, are not implemented as planned. So the deliberate strategy is much smaller. The rest, the intentions that don't get deliberately put into action, he calls unrealised strategy. So now you know what I mean by $1,000 words. These are just common sense things with fancy titles. So unrealised strategy is just the things you plan to do that you didn't do. And he says there are both good and bad reasons for having unrealised strategy. What might be a good reason?
Too expensive?
Too expensive, or wrong time, or just things change. Or you'll learn something better before you actually implement it. You learn something more effective to do. So there could be good reasons, or there can be bad reasons. Laziness, being distracted by a crisis, being overwhelmed by too many other tasks to do, forgetfulness, you didn't actually write it down. You know, there can be lots of bad reasons as well. So because a strategy isn't done, it doesn't make it either good or bad. It could be either. But what actually happens is much more influenced by 1,000 little decisions when they start to line up. And he calls that emergent strategy. So when we start to do things that head or push us in the same direction, those individual actions become an emergent or an emerging strategy. Does that make sense what he's talking about? And what he said was, what actually happens comes much more from this 1,000 little decisions than from the one big plan. So just to give you an example, in my own business before I was a part of LEAD, I operated as a sole consultant, and for me, my mission was to work with not-for-profits because that's what I loved, and they paid me, not very well, but some of them did. A few years into doing that, a philanthropic funder came along and asked if I would do some strategic planning with them. I gave them the I don't believe in strategic planning talk, you know, as well, and they still agreed. Out of that, they obviously had a positive enough experience of my unbelief and what we did together to recommend me to someone else. So there was another philanthropic funder in Wellington who also asked me to do something. Before I knew it, there were about 4 or 5 funders that I was doing work for. So I acted first. They were a lot of little decisions. I didn't make them coherently. There was no plan behind this. They just happened. And because I'm on the more opportunistic end, they happen because doors opened. If you're on the planful end, they might happen because of thinking about plans to do. But at that point, I stopped and thought, oh, what am I doing? I started out wanting to work with not-for-profits. I'm now working with funders about 1/3 of the time. Is that what I want to do? And when I stopped and thought about it, so that's where the thinking came second, or the reflection, when it comes second, we call it thinking. I thought, yeah, actually that's a good idea, because if I can help funders do things in ways that are more non-profit friendly and support the kind of co-member and values that I think are important, then I can have a bigger influence by just working with one particular client through all the groups that they fund, or a big chunk of them. So I thought, yes, it's a good idea, so I'm going to do more of it, or I'll keep doing that. In fact, I didn't decide to do more of it. I thought a third is enough. You know, I like to have some fun as well. But I decided I would keep doing that, and that I felt good about it. I felt that it was actually, I could identify that it was not distracting. It was actually supporting the mission that I was trying to achieve for my business. But all of that came out of here, emergent strategy. Does that make sense? So what I'd like you to do is have a chat with the people at your table, in 2s or 3s, 4 at the very most. Can you identify any example where an important strategy or a strategy of significance, doesn't have to be the most important one, emerged out of lots of little decisions like my work with funders strategy? By the way, in the 3rd year I wrote it down. This is my strategy. I will spend a third of my time working with funders. And it was true. Actually, I cheated. Okay, I'm going to interrupt you. Because I also want to get to some solutions and some practical things we can do, as well as do the critique. Sometimes it's quite hard to think of examples of emergent strategy, and maybe a better question is, think about the last time something changed, or the last few times something changed. Where did that change come from? Was it because it was written in a big plan, or was it come from some other source? And can you identify a lot of little decisions that led to it rather than one big one? There are some things that come from one big decision. You know, he's not denying that, but he's just saying that is by no means the only way things change. In fact, the majority way is, from his experience with companies, is the other. I just want to quickly say something about SWOT, because it is such a commonly used tool. First of all, it's important to just remember that it's a 2x2 grid. It's not 4 things, it's a 2x2 grid. There are the strengths and the opportunities are what's helpful to the organisation achieving its objectives. The weaknesses and threats are what's harmful. The strengths and weaknesses are, as I've said before, what we've got inside the organisation, our own resources, which includes intangible resources like reputation and relationships, as well as money and people. And the opportunities and threats are what's in the external environment. So it's often, we'll often know more about this than this. We often focus, because of the evolutionary tendency to look out for threats, on this rather than this. So we might have to get a balance, we might have to force ourselves to spend more time on the other. One of the main problems with SWOT is that everything can appear in every box almost. So it's worthwhile being fairly rigid about internal, external, positive, negative, and of course everything has a positive and a negative component. But is the preponderance of its impact positive or negative? Otherwise, you'll end up with everything in every box, and that doesn't help. The most helpful thing I've seen done with SWOT analysis that actually lead to something is to ask questions about the relationships then between the boxes. So if you've clearly separated things into the different boxes, you can say, how could we use our strengths to address these threats? Or how could we use our strengths to make more of these opportunities? Or what opportunities can help us buttress up our weaknesses? So it's about the relationship between them, and they tend to result in much more interesting kinds of issues generated here. So if there's one way to using SWOT that makes it of more use, that's the one that I've found. Just generating long lists And sometimes people think, yeah, you get a prize for the longest list. No, you don't get a prize for the longest list. In fact, you get a prize for the shortest list if that is the most significant factors, because your head can only get around a certain number of factors, and the longer the list, the harder it is to actually make use of it. Because you imagine if you had 50 things in each box and you were asking questions about the relationship, that's 50 times 50 times 50 times 50. And I don't know enough maths to remember what 50 quadruple. A lot. Yes, I think that's the technical answer. Whereas if you've got 3 by 3 by 3, that's 3 times 27, is it? Or something like that, I don't know. But it's a lot less. The other thing is that for those of you who have caught on to the benefits of strengths-based approaches or appreciative inquiry or asset-based approaches in what you do, SWOT kind of drags you back from the strengths-based approach to giving as much attention to the weaknesses and the threats as it does to building on the strengths. So I won't talk about the merits of why you should or should not use a strengths-based approach. I'm an evangelist for it, so if I start talking, I won't finish. But what I will do is, if you are interested in strengths-based approaches, there is an alternative to SWOT that is strengths-based that's called SOAR, which is a much nicer word. Rather than swatting things, you SOAR. And it's a 2 by 2 grid, and 2 of the grids are the same, the positive things, but so it has the internal strengths and the external opportunities. So, but it's much more focused on what are our greatest assets, not what are all of our assets, so it helps you kind of prioritise. And what's the best openings in the environment rather than what's every possible opportunity. So that helps you kind of be a bit more focused. But so then instead of having positives and negatives, it has current and future intentions. So it looks at what are our internal future intentions. In other words, what's our aspirations as an organisation that we would like to see us achieve? And externally, what's the results or impact in the community that we'd like to see us achieve? So again, you can, I think you make more use of this just the same as with SWOT by looking at the relationships between the two. So how can we use our strengths to maximise our impacts, etc. But where we want to keep the emphasis on building on strengths, this is an alternative tool for doing that. Okay, so a little bit more about strategy. First of all, probably one of the other people in the top 3 lists of global strategists, organisational strategists, would be a guy called Porter, who's also worked exclusively in commercial or for-profit organisations. And he talks about these 5 forces that drive strategy. And in the commercial world, strategy is actually easier, because ultimately in the commercial world your objective is to maximise the return to the investors or the owners. That's what commercial organisations are set up to do. They might want to do other things along the way, but that's what they're trying to do. So Porter could readily identify 5 factors which either threaten or enable you to maximise your return to your investors. The trouble with not-for-profits is that we have multiple and sometimes conflicting objectives and purposes, and everyone is slightly different from everyone else. So that's one of the reasons why it's also much more complex, the field of strategy, in community organisations. So if you think something is hard, you're probably on the right track, because it is, and you're doing the tough work. Business people can do it easily. They just got to maximise their profit. The other quick thing I just want to say in terms of context was where strategic planning came from, and basically the word strategy never left the battlefield until about a century ago. So strategy was only something that generals did. It was first mentioned in writing by Sun Tzu, probably because the Chinese wrote earlier than anyone else, but probably everyone else was thinking about it even if they didn't write it down. So Sun Tzu talks about the role of the second in command under the top general as having what could be translated into English as the director of strategic planning for the army. And that was about 2,400 years ago. Now I'm going to skip a few years in the history, so I'm not going to go through every year in the last 2,400 years. In fact, what I'm going to do is jump straight through to 1949. In fact, 1949 was the year that Henri Fayol's book Administration Industrielle et Générale was translated into English. He wrote it before the war, but no one read it in English until it was translated in 1949. And he was probably the person who invented the idea of management. Because he saw the similarities between the general, the bishop, the factory owner, the leaders in all kinds of different roles, whereas previously it had just been seen as different people do different things. And as a part of that, in trying to find out what were some of the similarities across the different roles, he talked about strategic planning. So he deliberately borrowed that idea from the military dimension and applied it to the other dimensions of business, the church, and other things in society. Though it's interesting, for him, a strategic plan were 10-yearly financial forecasts that were revised every 5 years. So these days, most of us would kind of laugh at a 10-yearly financial forecast. Even the brightest financial brains in the country in Treasury don't dare do more than 3 years, and by the third year it's usually totally unreliable. But that was the first kind of bringing it across from the military battlefield onto other arenas. The next significant thing happened in the Cold War in the 1960s. And strategic planning became very popular in two totally different places: big corporate America and the centrally planned Soviet economies. And you can see the common thing: big, centrally planned things. The Soviet economies didn't abandon strategic planning until they disappeared, so they clung on until the end as they sunk into the sunset. The big companies actually mostly abandoned it within 10 to 15 years of adopting it. So IBM, for example, which was one of the leaders in this, when it was most popular in the 1960s, had abandoned it by 1975. So it was an idea that people thought was the saviour for how to cope with change, make organisations better, have more control over things. When the IBMs and the big corporates did their analysis, they found out it's actually cost more than it benefited. The benefits were much smaller than everyone thought, because a lot of it was just writing history, and they'd never spent so much on their archival department before. But even when it did lead to changes, the changes tended to be small and not the only source of change. They discovered that, like Mintzberg did as well. And the cost was enormous. So for a big company, corporate-wide strategic planning meant involving bringing people together, often flying them around the country from all different parts of the organisation. And when they put an hourly wage on the time spent doing it, it was one of the most expensive things they did. It kind of beat their marketing budget often. So it was very, very expensive. And they would have kept investing in it if it had very, very big impacts, but it had very small impacts as a result. So they abandoned it. But just as they were about to abandon it, there was this wave of economic ideology hit the public sector, so that governments believed that everything that companies did was always better than any other sector, their own included, certainly much better than non-profits. So they tried to ape or appropriate the techniques and methods used in companies. And at that stage, because strategic planning was one of the big things, then public sector imported all the ideas of strategic planning, especially the one that was most popular in the US was PPBS, Plan Program Budgeting Systems. And I remember I was working in Australia as a relatively junior public servant in a government department, and the chief executive of our department had just come back from a study leave in America, and he came back and said, I've just got this great new idea, it's called PPBS, and we're going to be implementing strategic planning. And we did from then on. When the government departments, they found in practice quite a painful and energy-consuming thing to do, as the IBMs had done. So they said, well, if we've got to do it, when we fund the states, so this is the federal department in America, the states that we give money to should have to do it as well. It's their punishment as well, if they want to accept our money. And then the states, in turn, said, well, if we have to do this crap, the NGOs that we fund should have to do it as well. So it's flowed through to the non-profit sector. Most strongly in the international development field, where they have their own version of this called log frame, logical framework analysis. But in most areas, this is now considered, so what I'm saying is now considered heresy, and you would never say it out loud to a government funder, unless you were hoping to commit financial suicide. Okay, so, but the, so a couple of things about strategy and planning. The first thing is that both are important. So when IBM gave up corporate strategic planning, it did not give up planning. All of its divisions, units, teams had to have plans. And because, as I've said, people who write lists get more done, people who have plans achieve more of their plan, can tick off more of their plan. They just didn't try and tie it to big corporate-wide strategic plans. It was done on a much smaller basis, and it was a much more operational issue, which is why, going back to one of the first myths, or let's pretend games, actually, if you have staff in the organisation, staff are in a much better position to write up a plan than a board is, because staff know how much does it cost to run this program, how many people can we realistically serve, if you want to expand it, what would the marginal extra cost be, whatever. So so that's why it's actually sensible that they put up the proposal of what the plan should be, rather than relying on the board to suddenly think, oh, well, we'll have this bright new program and we'll put X amount of money for it, not because I know how much it costs, but because that was a nice number that I thought of, or for any other bizarre reason. You've probably heard of SMART objectives, SMART goals, SMART plans. Anyone know what that acronym stands for? Specific? Yeah. Measurable.
Achievable, realistic, and timely.
Yeah. Sometimes the R and the T get slightly changed, but that's definitely the most common one. I think that's the one I wrote down. Realistic and time-bound or timely. And so often the perceived good practice is that objectives and goals and strategies should be SMART. Yeah, you should have SMART goals. Who wants to have a dumb goal? But actually, SMART is very good for plans. You know, you do want to be specific in a plan. You do want to be measurable in a plan. You do want to be achievable in a plan. You do want to be realistic, and you do want to be time bound. But SMART is very stupid for strategies, because if strategy is the big picture, by nature it's not specific. And the most important things we do are very hard, if at all possible, to measure. And often they may not actually ever be achieved, but it gives us a very good direction, a very clear direction that we're wanting to head in. So while SMART is great for the plans, it can be quite stupid for the strategy. Given that it's hard to work without a bumper sticker these days, I decided to invent my own. So have your SMART plans, but I want to have pet strategies. Okay. So my idea for pet strategies is that they're politically feasible. So by that, what I mean is not party politics, but whoever has the power in the organisation, in the community served, will give it enough support for it to happen. Because if it doesn't have that support from people who have power and influence, it's not going to happen. Now, this doesn't mean we don't do uncomfortable things, but we need to be aware of the power balance in the organisation, in the community being served. Just so we don't get too political, it also needs to be ethically appropriate. So it needs to fit with our values and be consistent with our values. We can't have a means that's inconsistent with our end, or it undermines it. So we need to make sure that it's well aligned with our values, our ethics. And I think it also needs to be technically feasible. It can't be something that's totally impossible. There needs to be some reasonable logical behind it that this is likely to lead to the kind of objective that we want. We could convince an uninformed passerby that this was a good thing to do. We have some logic behind it. Probably I'd rather use the word logically based, but PEL doesn't sound as PEL strategy doesn't sound as good as pet strategies. So yeah, so I prefer to have pet strategies instead. So just to talk a little bit about what the differences are between plans and strategies. Oh, sorry. Before I do that, why this is a problem. It's not just a problem of semantics. The reason it's a practical problem is people in organisations will do one and think they've done both. So they will do something that they call a strategic plan, but it's actually just a plan. And that means they often haven't got an agreed or explicit strategy. Or they might do something that's called a strategic plan, but it's just a strategy. It's not actually a specific plan. But because they've got something that they've already called a strategic plan, then of course they've got strategy and plan covered off, but don't. To deal with this, people have invented other terms like operational plan to fit underneath the strategic plan, but it still doesn't fool people all the time, and people still fall into the error of doing one and thinking they have both. And effective organisations need both. They need a strategy, which is politically feasible, ethically based, and logical or technically possible. And they need some detailed, specific plans for getting there if they want to achieve that as efficiently as possible. So some smart plans as well. So that's why it's a problem not noticing the difference between the two. This is an example of what happens if you have something called a strategic plan, but all it has is a strategy and no plan. So Gilbert's evil boss says, here's the company vision and business plan. Vision, empowered employees working toward a common plan. Sounds good, says Gilbert. But the business plan is blank. And his boss says, I know it's confidential. How am I supposed to know what to do? Well, I'll yell at you if you do the wrong thing, says his boss. I thought I was empowered. Don't be so literal, says the boss. I'll just keep doing what I was doing. No, you fool. And they look at each other silently. We're doomed, aren't we? I don't know. I haven't seen the plan either. So you need both a strategy and a plan. Okay. The other thing that understanding the difference between strategy and plan helps us with is it helps us understand this difficulty in the middle and why we can get bogged down and grasp at straws when we're trying to identify strategy. Because in fact, strategizing and planning make the most of the two different ways of thinking, left brain thinking and right brain thinking. So planning is a left brain thinking exercise or activity. It works logically, step by step. You can follow things through. Does that make sense? Strategizing is the creative, the spark, looking for unusual connections out of which something new can grow. So it requires the right side. I said it correctly. I always do. So it requires right side brain. So if we start in one mode, and this is set up to start us in left brain thinking mode, logical, step by step, A leads to B, it's very hard to suddenly switch over into the other mode of thinking. So one of the little handy hints, which is a nice little strategic planning hack that I stumbled across, is have a break here. Ideally, it would be weeks apart. So you do the logical stuff first, and then you let that mull and come back a couple of weeks later to a second meeting. At the very least, put your lunch here if you're doing it in one day. Or if you're doing it in an afternoon, have your afternoon tea break here. So that there's a chance to actually physically get up, move around, and your brain might have half a chance of getting into the new mode. Whereas if you're going down one particular road, it's very hard to jump over into the other train track, to mix analogies. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's have a look at this thing then called strategy. I think we all know what plans are, who will do what by when. So let's have a look a little bit more at what this thing strategy is, and I'll leave you with, as it says at the bottom of the placemat, some alternatives for developing this. Also from Mintzberg, he talks about. Ooh, no, don't do that to me, sorry. Too fast. He talks about strategy as being four things. There we go. Pattern, plan, perspective, and ploy. Okay, so I was doing some work with some community organisations in Papua New Guinea, and I just explained my version of Mintzberg's 4 Ps to the co-trader, and I said to her, how would you communicate this to the groups? And she came up with the best story ever, so I'm going to use her story to explain it. When I do that, I'm going to get you to look out for the pattern, plan, perspective, and ploy in the story. Okay, so there's 5 tables and 4 things to do. So you can do the plan, you can do the pattern, you can do the perspective, you can do the ploy, and you can decide which one of those 4 you want to do. Have someone else do that. So have a quick decision. You will need to have one focus, so check to each other which one of those 4 you'll do. So do you know what ploy means?
No.
Sort of like trick to achieve something. When I think of ploy, I think of helping kids cope with daylight saving when they're little. And
only a little bit.
So we had this ploy of we'd always say, you know, don't let the daylight saving fool you, it's darker than you think. We also, when it was getting towards bedtime, would close all the curtains in the house so it felt darker, even though they could easily open the curtains and look outside. These were young kids. But basically that was our kind of ploy to make sure they didn't stay up an extra hour later and then be ratty in the morning. Is that enough of a definition of ploy? I think the others are okay, but want me to say anything about the others? What you're looking for? Okay, here's the story. This story is not for the faint-hearted, I should say. This is the story of Mother Eagle, who just hatched some eagle chicks and had to feed them. She had worked out from previous experience that some of the best food was baby chickens. Okay. And she had also known from having done this a few times before that baby chickens always seem to live around these strange creatures called humans. And that humans and baby chickens often lived in cleared circles of the forest. So she went flying over these cleared circles of the forest to try and get some food for her own eagle chicks. When she was flying over, she knew that she had to be high enough so that her shadow didn't fall on the ground and scare the chicks away. But of course she had to be low enough that she could dive down quickly and get them. Because she'd learned the way these chicks behave is that they run in circles around underneath their own mother's legs. And those circles get bigger and bigger until they come back to the safety of being underneath the protection of the mother hen's feathers and legs and body. So she knew that it was best to wait to try and anticipate when they were the furthest out in the biggest circle away from the protection of the mother's legs and feathers, because she'd also learned from experience that those legs could be quite ferocious in defence of baby chickens, and you didn't want to mess with those as you were diving down towards the earth. So she waited for just the exact right moment, staying up high enough so that she could see what was going on and was close enough to dive, but not too close so that her shadow warned the mother or the baby chickens that she was coming. And she swooped down just as they were going out on their third run of what was likely to be the longest circle away from the mother, and scooped up a baby chick, successfully taken home to feed her own baby eagles. Okay, that's the end of the story. Now, so what I want you to do is identify what was the plan, pattern, perspective, and ploy, and what are you pattern are you looking for? Okay, so just have a quick chat with your group. So what was the plan, pattern, perspective, and ploy in the story? So you were pattern, weren't you?
We are.
You had one. So where did you spot pattern in the story?
The experience that she had from previously feeding chicks, she knew what she had to look out for and how she was.
Yes. So she'd been smart enough to see patterns of cause and effect, things emerging, things associated with each other. They were not just random events. She could see the connections, the relationships between things. She didn't necessarily understand why or how the different things happened, but she was able to detect the patterns. Who else had patterns? Have you got anything to add to that?
I think we were quite confused.
You were quite confused. Well, I'm glad they
I
were.
thought the patterns were the circles.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the circles of in the forest, or the circles with the chicks were
Right.
flying around.
Yeah.
There was a pattern of behaviour.
Yes, yeah. So what she saw in the physical patterns were patterns of cause and effect or associated behaviour. So she knew that in what we call clearings, there were huts where people lived, and where there are huts that people live, they almost always have domestic chickens, and there'll almost always be new chickens being born at any one time. So she could associate the circles in the forest with the chickens, and she knew that the chickens went out in these regular repeated patterns of behaviour, coming back to the safety. So she used that to try and predict. So one of the things we use patterns for is to predict or to identify relationships. And so a lot of strategy is about prediction and relationships. That's the pattern. People from the world of chaos theory, which is about how do we cope with complexity and ambiguity, one of the most important tools is pattern recognition, being able to see the patterns, look at a mess of stuff and see the patterns that are emerging, not just all being individually unrelated things. And out of that, once we see the relationships, we can start to develop some strategy. I think that's why we get more out of SWOT when we look at the pattern or the relationships between the different boxes, rather than just look at the separate boxes. Plan. You had plan, I can see. Where was plan in the story?
I think it was what she thought to do based on the patterns.
Yes, yeah.
How will I use those patterns?
Yes. So the plan was the intention. So the plan was the forward-looking bit. But even in that, it depended on learning from experience and looking backwards as well. So that it doesn't exist kind of in isolation. But it is it is about having intentions, and a future orientation is a key part of any strategy. We can't just be backward looking. We have to have intentions about what we're going to do, and she had her intentions and she achieved them. Pattern, plan, perspective.
Oh, we've got the
Oh, you're a ploy, are you? Sorry, perspective.
The story, there's two different kinds of perspectives.
Yeah.
The story was told from the perspective of Mother April,
Yes.
not the perspective of the baby chick.
Exactly. Yeah. My strategy is your death of a child.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the other perspective was the literal perspective of her looking down on the forest.
Yes, yeah. So one of the things that Mintzberg found associated with successful perspective is it's usually based on some ability to step back. So a useful strategy is some ability to step back. Because only when you step back can you see the patterns, can you see the big picture. If you're down in the middle of the forest, all you see is the vines and the leaves and everything around you. You actually have to have the map view to see where things are heading. So when we think about what's the role of the board, that's probably one of the most crucial bits of the board. Because as we talked about on the very first night, not knowing all the details is one of the strengths of the board, because then you can focus on the big picture. It's less likely to be sucked into all the details and be able to give the perspective. So it should be focusing on what are the relationships between all these things, what's emerging, what's possible, how does this relate to our vision and goals, what's the big picture that's going on here. So boards have a great role in that, and are probably, unless they're a very hands-on board, and in all volunteer organisations you often do have hands-on boards, so that's perfectly fine. But unless you're a hands-on board, it's probably someone else who knows the details enough to do with the plan bit. Usually the staff. Ploy. It was the ploy in the...
Right on the third, when the chip was on its third circle.
Yes.
It's going to be furthest away. It was kind of a second one with the heights.
Yeah. So
Not too high.
it's about finding what works, little tricks. in the literature, people talk about this as like leverage. How can I get a big change from a small effort? So the ploy is finding the little openings, the little hacks that will have the big impact. So being able to detect when the chick was furthest away had a really big impact because it boosted her success rate enormously in her objective achievement performance report that she sent back to head office regularly. So it was a little thing that helped get a big impact. In chaos theory, people talk about this as the butterfly effect. So what's a little change that can ripple through the system and have the big impact that you, in the case of strategy, that you're looking for, not incidental. That might be the case in weather patterns. Okay, does that make sense a little bit more? So this strategy thing is a bit of a messier concept. It's not nice and neat and controllable like a plan, but that's its nature. But it helps to have all these different kind of components involved when we're thinking about strategy. In particular, the board's role, I think, is to have the big picture of strategy, and that means that it's important to make sure that, as this quote says, all the work being done achieves the aspirations of the vision and the mission and is consistent with the values. So it's a kind of check for alignment, that things are aligned with the big purposes of mission, vision and values. And believe it or not, there's actually some tools you can get to help you do that. So there are tools to help you this end, but they just don't call them strategic planning tools for some reason. One of them is based on some work that Bruce Henderson for the Boston Consulting Group did for investment strategies in commercial organisations, in maximising your return on your investment. And some people from the not-for-profit sector, Bell, Mazzarchi and Zimmerman, in 2010 applied this to non-profits. So what they talk about is, I love these 2x2 grids, you might know by now. Another 2x2 grid. Impact is the vertical dimension. So impact in achieving your mission, vision and values. And profitability or sustainability, you might want to call it, or viability, if you don't like the word profit, but it is basically profitability, is the horizontal axis. So if something has a low impact on achieving your mission and doesn't bring in much money, why the heck are we doing it? These are the things to stop, basically. On the other hand, if something, while it might have a low impact on your mission, generates a whole lot of income that you can use to subsidise some of these other things, it might be worth thinking about how we maximise the benefits from that with minimising the cost to us as an organisation, and make sure also it doesn't distract us from the mission. So this is where there's some cross-subsidisation, and they call these the money trees in organisations, so to generate the resources. If something has very high impact in achieving your mission but low profitability, they call these the heart of the organisation. So these are things we're going to do anyway, even if we all have to volunteer, do the baking ourselves, turn up ourselves, whatever, because it's so crucial to who we are. And we'll find the way of resourcing it some way. Hopefully from here, but we'll find it some way. So they call these the heart of the organisation. And then, but you do need to make sure you haven't got too many hearts. Because too many hearts can bleed the organisation to death. So you need to be very selective about what's really the heart of the organisation, not just a pet project of someone's. That's the key kind of strategy that comes out of here. This is the ideal box. So this is maximum impact on your mission and high profitability. So included in profitability, it means things that people like to fund or that donors like to give money for. Down in money trees, they would include any unrestricted donation. So if money is not given for a particular purpose, it's a money tree. So in itself, it doesn't help you achieve the mission, but how you use it in other programs does. If money is given for a particular purpose, then you count it in the square that it's given for. So restricted funds get counted in the square that it's given for. And high mission impact with high profitability are those things that are easy to fund, or people like to support, or it's flavour of the month with funders or whatever, as well as achieving your mission. Now this is the simple version because it's a 2x2 grid, which makes, the reason I like 2x2 grids is that they are simple, like me. There is a more complicated version of this, which has 5 dimensions. And I don't know how you portray 5 dimensions on a flat piece of paper, but I always have difficulty. So in fact, it usually takes about 5 or 6 pages to describe this process. But if this is a process or a tool that you're interested in, it's definitely worth having a look at the Macmillan matrix, because it's a little bit more sophisticated than just a simple 2x2, but it aims to do the same things. It looks at where does the money come from, how does this affect our mission, but it also looks at other things like, could other people do it just as well as us? Or is there no one else around who would do that? And a couple of other factors as well. So it is a little bit more sophisticated. So it's probably better for bigger organisations or organisations clearly with multiple programs. In Christchurch, I'm the chair of the Methodist Mission, and we run, programs for children, programs for elderly, housing, welfare, counselling, a whole lot of different things. So we use this regularly to check that we are aligned and that things are supporting what we want them to support, and if it's not, we know why we're doing it, or we stop doing it, or do it in a different way. But that's it's a multi-million-dollar organisation, and it's worth going to this. So the links for all of these are at the bottom of your table mat, as an incentive to take your table mat home with you. Have you got a table mat? Okay. Oh, yeah, great. Sorry, I thought I missed out. So there's one other tool that I particularly want to mention. So we'll do that, and then, as I said, there are other links for other ways of thinking about strategy. You'll see there's a link about strategic. I've forgotten the order they're in. Strategic questions and strategic learning. The strategic learning one is about how sometimes perhaps the most useful thing of a strategy a board could do is visit someone else. Have a look at how other people are doing this in other geographies, in other fields, with other target groups, because it's about linking across unlikely boundaries. So not all the boundaries are geographical. Think about how does this service happen with a different target group or with different populations. And there's a little bit about both using strategic questioning and using strategic learning to do that in that one article from Blue Avocado. Strategic stories is one of my favourite methods. I don't know who invented it, but it's most commonly associated with 3M. You know the people who invented the stick-it notes? They abandoned strategic corporate plans decades ago. Instead, they have 6 strategic stories that evolve and change over time, but basically there's pretty much a half a dozen stories going at any one time to communicate everything that's important about their organisation. So they use these stories, someone tells these stories to all newcomers as orientation, whether you're staff or board or whatever. At annual conferences, at least one of these stories will be featured, and people think about how their work reflects this story. When they give awards to people, a story will be told that most closely reflects the behaviour that's being awarded. When they do reviews, they'll use the stories as the kind of criteria for checking what they do. So one of the most famous stories is about how they invented the stick-it notes. The stick-it notes came from failure. The person with that task, a chemical engineer, was trying to invent superglue, and in fact invented the opposite. And his wife, who sang in the local choir, recognised how useful it would be to have a bookmark that you could take and put back on the hymn sheets and the songs that change every week. And she started giving them away to all her friends, and so he suddenly thought, this failure has got great potential, and went back and changed the whole project from being superglue to stick-it notes. It is now their most popular product and generates the most income for the whole group. That's the short version of the story. But you can see it communicates a whole lot of values about never give up, look for success in failure. You work for us 24 hours a day, including your wife. You know, there's lots of kind of values, and just the whole commitment to innovation, which is their byline, innovate. So when you see their logo, it's because it's free, and then innovate is their one-word description of what they do. So always looking for new things. So that's how they communicate the organisation-wide stuff, and then they say for each division, plan your projects within these stories. Theory of change, it's a little bit too complicated to explain in one sentence, but if you're interested in that, have a look there. And if you don't like to read, you can watch the YouTube video of me trying to explain it in 45 minutes. We don't have 45 minutes now, so you can follow that up. But that is also a useful way of thinking about strategy, because it's about making sure there's a logical alignment between what we do and our big picture goals. That's the shortest version I've ever been able to get it down to. And Macmillan Matrix we have talked about. But the one I do want us to have a little play with is, I've got these for tomorrow night as well, so there should be twice as many as you need. Just take one and pass the rest on. Is the elevator pitch. And why I want us to have a look at this is because it's really crucial at a board level, at a governance level, that we are clear about the why, what we're here for as an organisation. Because as I said, everything else in the plan needs to be aligned with that why. And it's the board's role in particular to check and ensure that there's a strong alignment between all that we do with those big whys. People invented the idea of an elevator pitch as, does anyone know what an elevator pitch is? Have you come across it before? Yeah. What's an elevator pitch?
It's basically telling somebody in a very short space of time the key things about what you're doing.
Yeah. So it was invented for people pitching, so that's where pitch bit of the elevator comes from, pitching to potential investors. And the idea was, it was somewhere between 30 seconds and 3 minutes. That was the boundaries that you had, which was the length of time it took the elevator in the Empire State Building to go from the, 3 minutes was to go from the top to the bottom, and 30 seconds was the average ride, apparently. And the idea was, if you had a potential investor trapped in the elevator with you for 30 seconds or 3 minutes, what could you say to her or him that would convince them to invest in you? So it's been applied to lots of other areas, and we're thinking about the elevator pitch as not something that you would just give to an investor, but as you say, something that you would explain to anyone, a funder, staff member, volunteer, to say what's the essence of our organisation. Now, it's really hard to come up with an elevator pitch from a blank page, and most people don't give any guidance about how to do it. I came across this, which comes from media workshop, non-profit media workshop. I think community media workshop, right? Which is an American non-profit that helps non-profits be better at their marketing and communications. So one of the things that they do is run workshops, and one of the tools they use in that workshop is this structure for developing an elevator pitch. So they invented this. This is not the only way to have an elevator pitch, but I found it only about 1,000% easier than starting from a blank page by just having these 4 questions or 4 half-written statements. So you know how, and then you write the problem or the issue you're addressing. So you know how there are poor people in the world. Well, what we do is, so then you do what's the special features or activities that your organisation does. Well, we help people get out of poverty, not just by giving them food, but helping them grow their own. I'm making this up as I go along, which is always dangerous. I haven't looked at the third and fourth question yet. So that everyone may live to their full potential in our community. We kind of like, and then this is often both the hardest and the most useful bit, to think of a metaphor that describes what you do as an organisation. So rather than literally what you do, what's the kind of metaphor behind it? Because metaphors are like mini stories. They're very powerful things that can contain a whole lot of information and ideas within them. And this exercise, I'm going to give you a chance to practice it yourself, but it's actually like a lot of things in life, eating, sex, it's best done with others. So you can only have so much fun by yourself. But it'll give you a bit of a try doing it by yourself. But it's really good to do that as a board or as a staff team to see if you can come up with an agreed elevator pitch for the organisation, the things that you all want to keep us focused on. And the handy thing about the elevator pitch, as opposed to some of the other statements that you'll get, is by nature they are pretty memorable, or much more memorable than long lists or descriptions, and certainly much more memorable than dot points. No one ever remembers the dot points, but you do remember the story or the four elements in something like an elevator pitch. So they're more likely to actually have an effect on day-to-day thinking as well, rather than just be done, put on the shelf. So in our last 3 minutes, I'll give you a chance to have a go at doing the elevator pitch for your organisation, see how far you can get through on that. Okay, I'm going to interrupt you. It's unlikely that anyone will have been able to do that in 3 minutes. It usually takes at least 5, sometimes days. It takes a little bit of thinking. And as I said, it's also much more fun if you can bounce ideas off other people. So have some other people from your team working on it as well. So I just want to summarise what I've been saying about the board's role in strategy. It's to define the organisational mission and values and regularly keep those under review for relevance. It's to ensure the strategy and plans are developed to achieve the mission and are consistent with the values, and to hold the organisation accountable for moving forward towards that mission, consistent with those values, and to ensure that the organisation has the capacity and resources in order to do that realistically. So I think they're the 4 things that every board has responsibility for. Other more operational boards will also be doing the planning as well, but I think this, for the strategy part, we all have to do that and make sure that that stuff is done well. I'll put that back up on the board in a moment in case anyone wants to write it down. Hopefully those messages have been seeping through the whole evening. But I just want to advertise next month. And next month we'll be doing the secret of better board meetings. So yeah, have a look at that one. And also to let people know that I've still got some time that's been funded by Rata Foundation to do one-on-one coaching or support with boards in Marlborough. So just contact me and see if we can do something. We can do one-on-one stuff over Skype or equivalent. if it's just with 1 or 2 people, or if you want to do something with a bigger group like the whole board, we can arrange something in association with the time I'm coming up here. Or if you've got spare cash as well, you can pay for me to come up another time, but my time will be free. So there are lots of alternatives, but we've only got about 2 more months before that this project expires, and that offer will expire soon after that. So if you think it might be useful to take advantage of that, please do. And I'll just go back to that last slide. And hope to see you all next month.